for today.
Without objection, the request is granted. Speaker's announced policy of January 6, 2015, the gentlewoman from Ohio, Ms. Beatty, is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the minority leader.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members be given 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and add any extraneous materials relevant to the subject matter of this discussion.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I rise this evening as co-anchor along with my classmate and scholar, Congressman Hakeem Jeffries from the 8th District of New York for tonight's Congressional Black Caucus Special Order Hour. Equal justice under the law, criminal justice reform, and challenging the school-to-prison pipeline. Congressman Jeffries leads by example. He is a member of the Criminal Justice Task Force, and he has a long personal and professional history of being a brother's keeper. This evening, the Congressional Black Caucus comes to the House floor to discuss the current state of America's criminal justice system and the necessary reform. Reform that will allow us to invest in our communities and expand opportunities for all Americans. Mr. Speaker, the school-to-prison pipeline is an epidemic that is plaguing schools across the nation. Mr. Speaker, the need and appetite to reform our federal criminal justice system has been building for years, and now it is clear that there is consensus that the time is now to take meaningful action. The school-to-prison pipeline refers to the policies and practices that pushes our nation's children, especially our most at-risk children, out of the classroom and into the juvenile and criminal justice system. Far too often, students are expelled, or even arrested for minor offenses that leads to visits to the principal's office a thing of the past. Statistics reflect that these policies disproportionately target students of color and those with a history of abuse, neglect, poverty, or learning disabilities. Those who are unnecessarily forced out of school become stigmatized and fall behind in their studies, Mr. Speaker. Many eventually decide to drop out of school altogether, and many others commit crimes in their communities. Former U.S. Attorney General Eric Holder discussed the issue in a speech to the American Bar Association in 2013, stating that rigid discipline policies transform too many educational institutions from the doorway of opportunity into the gateway to the criminal justice system, and that a minor school disciplinary offense should put a student in the principal's office, not in the police precinct. According to recent data by the Department of Education, African American students are arrested far more than their white classmates. Black and Hispanic students represent more than 70% of those involved in school-related arrests or referrals to law enforcement. And currently, African Americans make up 2/5 of combined youth today, Mr. Speaker. In my home state of Ohio, the impact of suspensions and expulsions on communities is striking. In Ohio, a history of prior suspensions from school is the #1 factor that leads children to dropping out of school. Children who do not finish high school, as we all are aware, are more likely to end up incarcerated or in our juvenile or criminal justice systems, and they are 3.5 times more likely to be arrested. Approximately 82% of the adult population is composed of high school dropouts. Mr. Speaker, unfortunately, this is a pipeline that reflects the prioritization of incarceration over education. But, Mr. Speaker, I come today as a member of the Congressional Black Caucus because I believe we can disrupt the pipeline. To do this, we need to be honest about the opportunity gaps that exist across our country and in our schools. Because you cannot talk about the school-to-prison pipeline without discussing what needs to be provided as economic opportunities. We need better educational chances for our young people. We need more support to our families so they can do the best job that they can or that they are capable of doing to help support their own children. We must confront prejudices in our nation head on. And that is why initiatives like the White House's My Brother's Keepers is so important. To My Brother's Keepers Task Force, it is a coordinated federal effort to address persistent opportunity gaps faced by boys and young men of color and ensure that all young people can reach their full potential. Mr. Speaker, lastly, this past weekend, I met with the dynamic men of the Columbus chapter of Kappa Alpha Psi Fraternity, Incorporated, in my district and saw My Brother's Keepers work at hand firsthand. I learned of their many forms of being role models, as being community mentors for at-risk students, particularly young males, who are in need of inspiration and counsel regarding their choice of a life's career. The mentoring men of Kappa Alpha Psi Fraternity Incorporated were men who are doctors and lawyers, government officials, teachers, and entrepreneurs, just to name a few. Mr. Speaker, these men are role models for the community. They bought a house in my district, and they used that home as an anchor to provide opportunities in leadership development, professional networking, and positive reinforcement. So tonight, it is important for me to put a face on what we need to do as one small example to stop the education prison to pipeline. So tonight I salute Philip Shotwell, Pole March, Richard Crockett, Vice Pole March, Attorney Byron Potts, Dr. Gus Parker, and Board of Directors Nathaniel Jordan, for being men who understand if we are going to stop the education or the school to prison pipeline, we need to look at our own districts. A young man asked them why he should stay in school, and they replied, "Young man, you are your own future. We are relying on you to be a law-abiding citizen, educated, self-sufficient, and a good citizen, because we don't want you to be a statistic in the school-to-prison pipeline." Mr. Speaker, tonight you will hear many stories. You will hear facts, and you will hear about legislation. And let me end by saying I am proud to be a co-sponsor of the Safe, Accountable, Fair, and Effective Safe Justice Act of 2015, H.R. 2944, a bill that recognizes the importance of mentoring and reducing recidivism and helps offenders think through the decisions that confront them when they leave prison. It is indeed my honor now, Mr. Speaker, to yield to our chairman of the Congressional Black Caucus, a person who has a long background in being an advocate and a fighter for those who are in our community and faced with many of the things that you're going to hear tonight, and that is Congressman G.K. Butterfield from North Carolina.
Let me thank you, Congresswoman Beatty, for yielding time, and thank you for your friendship, and thank you for all that you do, not just for the Congressional Black Caucus, but for all that you do for the constituents that you represent back in Ohio, and for what you do for all people in America. Let me also thank Hakeem Jeffries, Congressman Jeffries, for your great work and your willingness to participate in these special order hours. I know the evening is late sometimes, but the two of you come to the floor and you work so very hard, and thank you so very much. I want to spend my few minutes, if I can, Ms. Beatty, talking about just an overview of the criminal justice system. There's no question that the criminal justice system is broken. All of us, I think, can agree on that. Those on the left and those on the right, all of us, even for different reasons perhaps, come to one conclusion, that the criminal justice system is in need of serious reform. I know that we are debating legislation here in the House regarding reforming the criminal justice system. Our colleagues over in the Senate are doing the same, but it's time for action. It's time for action on criminal justice reform in the 114th Congress. As many of my colleagues know, I spent 30 long years in a courtroom. Half of those as a lawyer, the other half as a judge. Most of the 15 years as a judge, I was a trial judge, which meant that I was on the front line in our criminal justice system, and I saw it firsthand. And I can tell you, without a question, that the criminal justice system in America is in need of serious reform from the top to the bottom. We've all heard the statistics, and I'm going to repeat them again tonight. 2.2 million Americans are in prison, and of those, that number is disproportionately African American. 25% of the world's prison population right here in the United States of America. Just think about that, Ms. Beatty. We are 5% of the world's population, but 25% of those who are incarcerated in the United States of America. And so we have a serious problem of mass incarceration that must be reduced. But the point that I want to put into the record tonight is that of those who are incarcerated in this country, 90% of those are incarcerated at the state level. 10% incarcerated at the federal level, 90% incarcerated at the state level. And so when we discuss criminal justice reform, and Congressman Bobby Scott is going to be speaking in a few minutes, and he talks about this all of the time, as well as Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee. When we discuss criminal justice reform, we must not only talk about reform at the federal level, but we must find ways to require states to reform their criminal justice system at the local level. We should encourage states to take a serious look at their system and to seek ways to reduce mass incarceration at the state level without posing any harm to the community. Too many of those incarcerated at the state level are in prison for drug-related offenses and crimes that don't endanger the community whatsoever. We should encourage states to enact expungement laws. And we get telephone calls all of the time, and I'm sure my colleagues get the same calls as well. We get calls all of the time from those who are seeking ways to expunge their records so that young men and women who have served in the criminal justice system can get some of those offenses removed from their record, particularly those offenses dealing with petty crimes and misdemeanors and drug-related offenses. Because when you have these offenses on your criminal record, it prevents young people from getting gainful employment that they so richly deserve. We also need to encourage states to look at ways to remove criminal charges from criminal records that did not result in a conviction. And I think most of my colleagues can relate to that. We know that so often police officers at the local level will charge a young offender with multiple offenses at the time of arrest. And some of the offenses are not even deserving of a charge. But sometimes police have a tendency to overcharge at the time of arrest. And then when the case finally comes to court, those 10 or 12 charges are reduced down to one charge or two charges. And the defendant pleads guilty and the case is disposed of, while the other 8 or 10 charges that are dismissed continue to be on the young person's criminal record for a lifetime. And so often, just the fact that the individual has been charged with a crime prevents that young person from getting a job. So often, it makes a difference. Finally, I want to thank you, Ms. Beatty, for talking about using the court system to punish students. That happens. It happens in every state in America. And our school systems, our public school systems should not use the court system as a means of punishment for students who have behavioral problems in school. And so I want to thank all of my colleagues for all of your work. Thank you for your effort. Thank you for your tremendous interest in this subject, because it's real. And we know it, and we need criminal justice reform, and we need it now. Thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you, Congressman Butterfield. And we certainly agree with you that the criminal justice system is broken. And that's why the Congressional Black Caucus is here tonight, to make sure that we be prepared to outline the steps and the legislation that we're going to be in the forefront. And I want to thank you for your leadership in making this a top priority for the Congressional Black Caucus. Thank you. Mr. Speaker, it is now my honor and privilege to yield to the gentleman from the 3rd Congressional District of Virginia, a true scholar, an attorney, and someone who is a leader in tonight's topic, someone who has worked tirelessly to make sure that we do more than just come and stand and talk about this issue tonight, but he comes tonight to talk about real reform, to talk about making a difference in our broken criminal justice system. And that is my friend, Congressman Bobby Scott.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the gentleman from New York and certainly the gentlelady from Ohio for organizing this special order to discuss the need for criminal justice reform. Mr. Speaker, we have serious fundamental problems with our criminal justice system today. For too long, policymakers have chosen to play politics with crime policy by enacting so-called tough-on-crime slogans and sound bites, such as 3 strikes and you're out, mandatory minimum sentences, and if you get it to rhyme, apparently it's better. If you do the adult crime, you do the adult time. As appealing as these policies sound, their impacts range from negligible reduction in crime to actually increasing the crime rate. But as a result of these policies, the United States, despite representing only 5% of the world's population, has 25% of the world's prisoners, now has the highest incarceration rate of any nation in the world by far. There are 2.2 million people behind bars in this country. That's triple the number of prisoners we had just 3 decades ago. At over 700 persons incarcerated for every 100,000 population, the United States far exceeds the world's average incarceration rate of about 100 per 100,000. Recent studies have questioned the sanity of this mass incarceration. For example, the Pew Research Center on States has estimates that after about 350 per 100,000, any crime reduction value begins to diminish, and over 500 per 100,000, incarceration becomes actually counterproductive. As I said, our rate now is at 700 per 100,000, and these counterproductive effects are created today because there are now too many children being raised by a parent in prison and too many people with a felony record unable to find jobs. The impact of our tax dollars is also distressing. The Bureau of Prisons is consuming too much of the Department of Justice's budget, meaning that the department has fewer and fewer resources for other programs that can actually reduce crime and enhance public safety. And the tough-on-crime approach fails the hardest on minorities. While the incarceration rate overall in the United States is approximately 700 per 100,000, for blacks, the incarceration rate is over 2,200 per 100,000, and some jurisdictions lock up blacks at the rate of 4,000 per 100,000, a rate 40 times the international average. Now, the war on drugs has exacerbated this problem. Over 2,000 federal prisoners are now serving life without parole for nonviolent drug crimes, and many more are serving unduly harsh sentences for nonviolent offenses. The racial disparities are staggering, despite the fact that whites engage in drug offenses at a rate equal to or often higher than African Americans. African Americans are incarcerated on drug charges at a rate 10 times greater than that of whites. So we all agree that there's a problem with mass incarceration, and so what's the best way to solve it? While reviewing any legislative package called criminal justice reform, I think there's some key principles that we have to address. First, reform must meaningfully address the problem of mass incarceration by significantly reducing admissions to prison and shortening a prisoner's length of stay. Second, any reform must address the primary driver ballooning the federal and state populations, and that is mandatory minimum penalties, especially those for drug and firearm offenses. Third, we must address the disparate impact on race in the federal criminal justice system that has resulted from the application of many neutrally worded policies and laws. Fourth, reform must address mental health and addiction issues as a public health issue, requiring intervention, treatment plans to resolve underlying issues that led those to be involved in the criminal justice system, rather than implementing so-called tough-on-crime, lock-em-up approaches. Everybody knows that the war on drugs has failed. We need to address drug abuse more as a public health issue and less as a criminal justice issue. Fifth, we must provide comprehensive reentry and rehabilitation services and incentives for completing those programs found to actually work, with a particular focus on those with the greatest need. And finally, any legislation must be based on research and evidence, not poll-tested slogans and sound bites or political negotiations unrelated to research and evidence. So how do the current proposals stack up? First, we look at the current bills that have been reported out of the House and Senate Judiciary Committees and notice that they fail to embody any of the principles and, in fact, often take the opposite approach. While these bills reduce the number of admissions and length, in some cases, they also create new mandatory minimums, either new mandatory minimums or mandatory consecutive enhancements. They enhance existing mandatory minimums to apply to people who would not get them under the present law, and irrationally limit who can benefit from prospective and retroactive relief provisions. It is unknown whether there will be an overall increase or decrease in prison impact at the 10-year point after implementation if these bills pass, compared to doing nothing. The United States Sentencing Commission has been unable to quantify the impact of the expansions or limitations for relief. So the fact that we do not have numbers means that we cannot determine whether these bills will have any meaningful effect on mass incarceration. Though the bills do shorten two supersized mandatory minimums, they do not eliminate any mandatory minimums. The Senate bill actually creates two new ones, and both bills create new mandatory consecutive sentencing enhancements which must be served after any other sentence. Both bills expand mandatory minimums for drug and gun offenses by applying them to people who would not be eligible to receive them today. And if the problem is we're trying to address mass incarceration, why are those in the bill to begin with? Now, neither of the bills do anything to address the racially disparate impact that pervades our criminal justice system. Federal mandatory minimums, in particular, those for drug and firearm offenses, have been studied and have been found to have a racially disparate impact. These bills do nothing to eliminate mandatory minimums. Even though they reduce some, they create new ones, expand others, and create new sentencing enhancements, so the bills may actually make racial disparities in sentencing even worse than they are under present law. Finally, both bills put limits on who can receive prospective and retroactive relief, and if you look at the limitations, we will find that they have a racially disparate impact on minorities. On the issue of the war on drugs, both bills also fail to treat drug abuse and addiction as a public health problem. In fact, the strategy used in the bills to address heroin addiction is not a public health approach. The bills impose mandatory additional prison time. This is not a public health research-based approach. On the comprehensive reentry and rehabilitation services to reduce recidivism, these bills have turned science and empirical evidence upside down. They give the greatest incentives for completing the programs to those with the lowest need, while categorically barring offenders with highest risk from benefiting from the rehabilitation programs. This approach not only violates research, but it will exacerbate the current racial disparities in the criminal justice system. Mr. Speaker, there's ample research available to show what credible criminal justice reform ought to look like. For example, Texas, one of the nation's most conservative states, recently passed criminal justice reform legislation based on research and evidence, and they indicate, and the result was a significant reduction in crime, significant reduction in incarceration, and a saving of billions of dollars. The Safe Justice Act, the Safe, Accountable, Fair, and Effective Justice Act, which I co-sponsored with the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Sensenbrenner, that the gentlelady from Ohio pointed out that she is supporting, was based on the Texas model and includes evidence-based prevention and early intervention programs, reducing incarceration even at the state level as well as the federal level, comprehensive police training and funding for body cameras, drug and veterans courts, a significant reduction in the use of mandatory minimum sentences, and rehabilitation for all of those in prison, and second chance programs for those who have been released. It has broad bipartisan support. All of the provisions in the bill are fully paid for by reallocating the reduction in mandatory minimums, and it shows that we do not have to accept a bill that fails to conform to evidence and research. Mr. Speaker, criminal justice reform legislation ought to be consistent with research and evidence that is readily available, and what I can tell, the bills reported out of the House and Senate Judiciary Committees have nothing based in research and evidence, and sadly seem more concerned about the politics of criminal justice reform with little regard to actually wanting to end our nation's addiction to mass incarceration. The Safe Justice Act is a better evidence-based approach which will, if enacted, reduce crime, save money, and reduce racial disparities that pervade our criminal justice system. So I appreciate the gentlelady from Ohio and the gentleman from New York for hosting tonight's special order and yielding me this time, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you so much, Congressman Scott, for clearly articulating to us why we cannot let our criminal justice system remain on this trajectory. Mr. Speaker, I would now like to yield to the Congresswoman from the 13th District of California. My colleague and my friend is someone who travels the world, advocating for those who live in poverty, advocating for those who are incarcerated in this broken criminal justice system that we are focusing on tonight. It is my honor to yield her as much time as needed. Congresswoman Barbara Lee.
Let me first thank the gentlelady from Ohio for those very kind and humbling remarks, but I want to thank you for your tremendous leadership and for continuing to come down here each and every week to ensure that your voice, the Congressional Black Caucus, Congressman Jeffries' voices are really put forth so that the people of our country will understand the critical issues before us and the fact that the Congressional Black Caucus is really leading on each and every issue. You and Congressman Jeffries really have done a phenomenal job. You both have gone way beyond the call of duty, and so we thank you so much for your efforts. Make no mistake, and I think we're hearing this over and over again tonight, mass incarceration is a crisis in our country. The United States of America imprisons far more people than any other nation in the world. When African Americans are incarcerated at 6 times the rate of whites, it's no surprise to me. It's no surprise that African Americans constitute nearly half of the total 2.3 million incarcerated Americans in 2008. Together, African Americans and Latinos comprised 58% of all prisoners in 2008, even though African Americans and Latinos make up approximately 1/4 of the United States population. While our prison population grows unchecked, and it's growing unchecked, we continue to criminalize our students rather than invest in their education. Right now, we spend $10,500 a year to educate a child, but we spend $88,000 a year to keep a child locked up. That is unacceptable. Let me repeat that. It costs 8 times more money to keep a child in jail than to educate them and prepare them for a good future. And we're not just talking about a few children here. Our country incarcerates 5 times more children than any other nation in the world. Sadly, 2/3 of these kids will never return to school. When we lock up these children, we are essentially throwing away the key. Instead of preparing them for a future, we're just getting them ready for a life in a cell. Now, let me be clear. From the moment many of these children are born, they are funneled into the prison pipeline. Simply put, the system is really stacked against them. For instance, 1 in 3 African American child lives in poverty today, while 1 in 4 Hispanic child lives in poverty. Mr. Speaker, while black children represent just 18% of preschool enrollment, they account for nearly half of all preschool suspensions. Now, Congresswoman Beatty, we're talking about toddlers ages 2 to 5. These kids don't even get a start, let alone a head start. They are being suspended from school. How do you suspend toddlers and babies from school? Something's wrong with this. And so I must say, in the Appropriations Committee are trying to address this with the Department of Education. This is immoral. When they get older, African American students are 4 times more likely to be expelled from school than their white peers for the same offense. More than half of all students who are involved in school-related arrests or referred to law enforcement are black or Latino. This has a lasting effect and impact on young students. Studies show that students who are disciplined by schools are more likely to end up in the juvenile justice system, where their chances of returning to school are slim to none. This is unacceptable. These young people are having their futures ripped away before they even have a chance. We need to change the system and end the school-to-prison pipeline. First, we must start by making serious investments in our young people. We should ensure that all students have equal access to high-quality public school education. We must also expand summer youth job opportunities and summer training programs so that our teens have the opportunity to learn workforce skills, contribute to their communities, and start a path to economic opportunity. As a member of the Education Funding Subcommittee, we're working to try to make sure that these resources become a priority of our subcommittee, which they unfortunately aren't at this point. We also need to tear down the institutional racism, quite frankly, that's holding students of color back, trapping our young people in a broken criminal justice system. I'm reminded of when I was in the California legislature, I was on the Public Safety Committee, and proposals were brought to us, plans for building prisons 10 to 12 years out for kids who were just starting kindergarten. That's what we had to deal with. And now we see what has happened to the prison industrial complex in California. That's why we must work together and pass legislation to end mass incarceration and fix our broken criminal justice system. We need to get rid of these outdated minimum sentencing standards. These are relics from the failed war on drugs and disproportionately target people of color. In California, once again, the 3 strikes law passed. Of course, I opposed that while in the California legislature. This law has incarcerated young African American men for nonviolent drug offenses 25 years to life. 25 years to life for a nonviolent drug offense. We need to repeal that law. We also need to make sure that law enforcement officers reflect the diversity of communities that they police. So we've introduced HRES 262, which supports effective community-oriented policing and encourages greater diversity in law enforcement. During last appropriation seasons, the Congressional Black Caucus worked with Congressman Lacy Clay to direct the Department of Justice to begin collecting training data. Our legislation tracks when officers receive training for the use of force, racial and ethnic bias, de-escalation of conflict, and constructive engagement with the public. But this was just a small step. We need to do more. With regard to reentry, banning the box is essential. We've worked with the White House to try to make sure that federal contractors ban the box. Still, we haven't accomplished that, but federal agencies cannot now ask for one's criminal history records. In my district, we do expungement. We do record remedies. We've remedied thousands and thousands of young people who now can go on and move forward with their lives. And I want to thank the Family Law Center in Oakland, California for doing that. We need to go back to the drawing board and repeal the welfare reform provisions that deny for life. There's a federal ban for food stamps, eligibility for public housing, and Pell Grants for those who have been incarcerated for drug felonies. Now, you know who that targets. Primarily African American and Latino men. They don't even have a second chance when they get out of jail as a result of these lifetime bans. And so finally, let me just say it's time to really look at this problem in a big way and to understand that we have to dismantle, not reform, But we have to dismantle this prison industrial complex and start investing in our communities, especially our young children. And we must understand that in doing this, we have to look at institutional and systemic racism, which is at the core of many of our policies. And so this is a fight that we're going to win, but it's going to be because of all of us here in the Congressional Black Caucus, Congresswoman Beatty and Jeffries and Scott and Jackson Lee, and the entire membership who continue to fight the good fight to make sure that finally we will begin to see a real criminal justice system, which it is not right now.
Thank you
again.
so much, Congresswoman Lee. And so when people asked us, why are we doing this today, thank you for reminding us that the system is stacked against us, and we have had the future of so many of our young folks ripped away from them. Thank you so much. Mr. Speaker, I would now like to yield to the gentlewoman from the great state of Ohio, from the 11th Congressional District. She is an attorney. She has served as a former mayor. She is the immediate past chair of the Congressional Black Caucus. She is someone who gives us advice, and I remember her saying to us, push the envelope, because you are the voice for the voiceless. Look at the legislative issues that will make a difference in the lives of others. So tonight, we come to talk about equal justice under the law. We come, Mr. Speaker, to challenge this House. So it is my great honor to yield as much time as she needs to Congresswoman Marcia Fudge.
I thank the gentlelady for yielding, and just to say to my fellow Ohioan and friend, it is a pleasure to watch you and the gentleman from New York on this House floor every Monday night bringing the message of the Congressional Black Caucus, because indeed you are the people who carry our message to the United States, and I thank you both. Mr. Speaker, the school-to-prison pipeline is robbing far too many children of productive futures. Instead of learning in classrooms, a large percentage of our nation's at-risk students sit in jail cells. The numbers don't lie. Black students are suspended and expelled at a rate 3 times greater than white students. More than 1 in 4 boys of color with disabilities and nearly 1 in 5 girls of color with disabilities receives an out-of-school suspension. And studies show that students who are suspended or expelled in school are more likely to end up in prison. Our nation's children deserve better. It is time we prioritize education and not incarceration. Comprehensive criminal justice reform must include policies which dismantle the school-to-prison pipeline. We must reauthorize the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act, a bill that funds delinquency prevention and improvements in state and local juvenile justice programs, supports restorative initiatives, and promotes early intervention. Disrupting the pipeline will provide a pathway for a successful future and lessen the burden on our current judicial system. The number of people incarcerated in America quadrupled between 1980 and 2008. Of the more than 2.3 million Americans incarcerated today, more than 1 million of them are black. In my home state of Ohio, more than 50,000 people are incarcerated in a system that was designed to only hold 39,000. And on average, states across this nation spend $30,000 per year to house 1 inmate. That's at least $19,000 more per year than we spend to educate 1 child. It is time we get our priorities straight. As ranking member of the Education and Workforce Subcommittee on Early Childhood, Elementary, and Secondary Education, promoting policies that keep our children in school is one of my top priorities. And I ask my colleagues, what are yours? Mr. Speaker, Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman Fudge, for reminding us again of the value and the importance of our work. Mr. Speaker, at this time, it is indeed my honor to yield time to my co-anchor of tonight's Congressional Black Caucus Special Order Hour. As I said earlier, Congressman Hakeem Jeffries is not only a scholar, he too is an attorney. But he is someone who walks the talk. He is someone who has a long history of being his brother's keeper. So tonight, when we discussed this topic, when we talked about the challenge, when we talked about all of the plethora of things that are incorporated in why we must come forward tonight, Mr. Speaker, to challenge the criminal justice system stacked against us, broken, and certainly we have heard the disparities as it relates to African Americans. So it is indeed my honor to ask my co-anchor to share with us our challenge, Congressman Hakeem Jeffries.
Well, I thank the distinguished gentlelady from Ohio, my good friend, the distinguished and dynamic anchor for tonight's special order, Congresswoman Joyce Beatty, for yielding and for your continued leadership and for leading the discussion on the House floor today as it relates to the urgency of this Congress and America dealing with the school-to-prison pipeline, mass incarceration, and the prison industrial complex that so many of my colleagues have explained and exposed here on the House floor today. A few years ago, I had a conversation that has always stuck with me in the area of criminal justice when I was speaking to a formerly incarcerated individual who spent several years behind bars, incarcerated in the New York State Penitentiary. He's turned his life around and he's now an advocate for criminal justice reform, but he said to me that on his final day, after being in prison for years, upstate New York, he had a conversation with a high-ranking corrections officer, supervisor, who he had gotten to know and thought he had befriended to some degree during his time of incarceration. And on that last day, he said to this young African-American incarcerated individual who was on his way out, he said, "I just want to thank you." And this gentleman was a little perplexed. He wasn't sure what he was talking about. He said, "Well, I just want to thank you for helping me to get my boat. And beyond that, I want to thank your son, who's going to help my son get his boat as well." That conversation has really haunted me because in such a powerful and profound way, what it captures is the essence of what the prison industrial complex represents, which is this decision that was made in so many parts of the United States of America, certainly in New York, by Democrats and Republicans, when the automobile factories and the steel mills, the manufacturing plants began to close in the 70s and in the 80s, devastating parts of the upstate economy. A decision was made in place of those factory jobs to build prisons in their place as a means of economic development for depressed upstate communities. But here's the problem. If you build it, someone's got to fill those prisons. And in order to fill those prisons, several things have developed which we are in the process of trying to dismantle right now. The school-to-prison pipeline and the criminalization of young people, particularly in communities of color, where they basically are not given a chance from the very beginning. And as a result of being channeled unjustly often into the criminal justice system at an early age, essentially become economic commodities for those who have come to rely on prisons to replace the factory and manufacturing jobs that have left the United States of America. And that's been a big problem. In New York, it's a problem in other parts of the country, and it is a shame here in the United States of America that we've gone from a place where when the war on drugs began in 1971, President Nixon declares drug abuse public enemy #1. There were less than
350,000 people incarcerated in America. Even when the crime bill that's being heavily debated in the public domain right now was passed in 1994, at the height of the concern about crime here in the United States of America, the incarcerated population was still under 900,000 people. But we've gone from less than 350,000 in 1971 to under 900,000 in 1994 to more than 2.2 million in 2016. 5% of the world's population, 25% of the world's incarcerated individuals. We incarcerate more people than any other country in the nation, and it is shameful. And the school-to-prison pipeline is a large part of that dynamic, along with the failed war on drugs. And so we're going to have to deal with this situation in a meaningful way. The statistics clearly show that if you suspend a young person, that individual, often a black or Latino boy, is less likely to graduate and complete school and more likely to become entangled in the criminal justice system, because we've applied an overly punitive approach to discipline, particularly in the inner city. Now, in this chamber, I've seen surprising levels of compassion as it relates to dealing with the heroin and opioid crisis that's sweeping across America right now, and I'm glad that folks have decided to take a different approach than the approach that was taken in the 1980s with the crack cocaine epidemic that was sweeping across communities that those of us in the Congressional Black Caucus represent. I welcome this newfound compassion. I just hope that you would extend it now, not just to the manner in which we deal with the heroin crisis, that's important, but let's extend it to the overcriminalization that is taking place as it relates to young people across America, particularly in black and brown communities. I'm glad that we've become enlightened as it relates to moving away from punishment and toward prevention and intervention as it relates to the heroin and opioid crisis. Let's also become enlightened in terms of dealing with breaking the school-to-prison pipeline. And so we'll have more to say as we move forward with this discussion, but I know there are other members who would like to contribute to this hour of power that Representative Joyce Beatty has brought to the House floor in connection with the CVC special order. And so I'll yield back to the distinguished gentle lady from the great state of Ohio.
Thank you so much, Congressman Jeffries, for reminding us that the United States makes up less than 5% of the world's population, yet incarcerates nearly a quarter of the global prison population. Thank you for also being on point and reminding us, Mr. Speaker, if we are to reform America's criminal justice system and advance efforts to break the cycles of incarceration in African American communities, in low-income communities, then we must unite and make sure that we pass real legislation. Mr. Speaker, can you advise me of how much time we have left, please?
The gentlewoman has 12 minutes remaining.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, at this time, it is indeed my honor to ask the gentle lady who hails from the 18th Congressional District of Texas. Of the many things that this Congresswoman does, she serves on the Judiciary Committee. She has been a long-time advocate for reforming the criminal justice system. I refer to her as a strong voice, a strong advocate, and truly a scholar. At this time, I would like to yield time to the gentlewoman from Texas, Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee.
Speaker, I want to add my appreciation to the gentlelady from Ohio, the gentleman from New York, and the members who have spoken, including the chairman of the Congressional Black Caucus, Mr. Butterfield, the former chair, Ms. Fudge, and the ranking member on the Education Committee, Mr. Scott. There could not be a more important topic than the topic that we're speaking about tonight. And there are moments in history that I think come at times when urgency is the call of the day. It is often said that Dr. King emphasized in his tenure the urgency of moving forward on civil rights and spoke eloquently about the fact of why we cannot wait. And so if I might, I want to capture his theme of why we cannot wait to end the school-to-prison pipeline, end it now, and begin the whole comprehensive approach of criminal justice reform. Let me take Texas as an example and cite some very important statistics from the Appleseed report, and as well comment on the work that we're doing in the Judiciary Committee. So glad at this moment in history to be the ranking member of the Criminal Justice Committee and working with the members of my subcommittee, including Mr. Jeffries, who is a member, Ms. Bass, who's a member, and a number of other members as well, on this very difficult hurdle that we have. Let it be very clear that this hurdle of criminal justice reform is, as I heard Mr. Jeffries make mention of, that we have taken hold to this issue of opioids and heroin in a way that not one single bill was passed last week that had a criminal focus, particularly out of the Judiciary Committee. Not one bill had mandatory minimums. In the debate last week on Friday, I reiterated over and over again, no mandatory minimums in this legislation. Then that should be the perfect that we try to achieve going forward on criminal justice reform. But let me give the beginnings of that very tragic outcome in America, filling up the nation's prison, not having criminal justice but criminal unfairness. It starts with a path to incarceration, which includes in the schools stops failing public schools, zero tolerance in other school discipline, policing school hallways, disciplinary alternative schools, and court involvement in juvenile detention. All of these are a path for students to incarceration, and it is without understanding what a Class C misdemeanor ticket and a trip to court for thousands of Texas students and their families mean. In Texas, students are as young as 6 have been ticketed at school in past years, and it is not uncommon for elementary school students to be ticketed by school-based law enforcement. School-based arrests of students often occurs without prior notice to parents. Police officers in some Texas schools are resorting to use of force, measures more commonly associated with fighting street crime, pepper spray, tasers, and trained canines when a schoolyard fight breaks out or when students are misbehaving in a cafeteria or at a school event. This should not be the picture for a 6-year-old or a 4-year-old or an 8-year-old or an 11-year-old or a 13-year-old. This should not be equated with school. And let me read to you part of the Appleseed report and a quote by Ryan Kellis Turner and Mark Goodner. In little over 2 decades, a paradigm shift has occurred in the Lone Star State. The misdeeds of children, acts that in the near recent past resulted in trips to the principal's office, corporal punishment, or extra laps under the supervision of a middle school or high school coach. Now, of course, corporal punishment will be eliminated from that. But what is worse, incarceration, now result in criminal prosecution, criminal records, and untold millions of dollars in punitive fines and hefty court costs being imposed against children ages 10 to 16. It is conservatively estimated that more than 275,000 non-traffic tickets are issued to juveniles in Texas each year. And based on the information from the Texas Office of Court Administration, they grossly exceed numbers of non-traffic tickets issued to students may well grossly exceed that number because it was very difficult to get it. Texas can interrupt this destructive cycle and prevent the loss of more young people to the school-to-prison pipeline through early intervention, focus less on punishment, more on creating positive school environments that address students' academic and behavioral needs. Let me just say that police officers in some Texas schools are resorting to use of force. Now, they are supposed to be there as SROs. SROs are supposed to have educational training. SROs are supposed to be able to have the understanding of how to deal with counseling issues and teaching that base itself on evidence that is evidence-based. But here is the problem. The problem is that they are focused more on law enforcement. So I am glad to be part of this special order tonight that deals with the pipeline that has started working our children toward incarceration by overcrowding schools, lack of qualified teachers, and inadequate resources. And then the zero tolerance for school discipline on children, and the rate of suspension having increased dramatically in recent years from 1.7 million in 1974 to 3.1 million in 2000, and it has gone beyond that. And the greatest emphasis has been on children of color. So here is my call to the United States Congress. We have to begin the process of dismantling the school-to-prison pipeline. We have to understand that children can learn. No child is a throwaway. I offer that often in my remarks in my district. And the detention system is an unfair system. I don't know how many of you realize that when a child is sent to juvie, that child can remain there until they reach the age of 21. How does that happen? Even if their sentence is not as egregious as one might think. A simple misbehavior in school. And the way that happens is because in juvenile, you can assess more time on a child without telling that child's parent because that child did not follow orders, or in essence that that child did not behave, or that child chewed gum when you told them not to. We in the Judiciary Committee are working on juvenile justice reform. And one of them that I'm most concerned about and want to move is ending solitary confinement for juveniles, recognizing the Caliph's law that caused the death of one inside of the New York prison in Rikers Island, where an individual was killed, not killed, but was in solitary confinement who had not been rendered guilty in Rikers Island. And so we want to eliminate putting juveniles in solitary confinement because the tragedy, Mr. Speaker, was that that youngster was released ultimately, but as they were released ultimately, then they, in essence, committed suicide. So I want to close my remarks by indicating that I want to turn this system upside down. I want to make sure that we deal with juvenile justice reform. I want to ban the box. We've done that in legislation that has not yet passed. And I want to make sure that we have alternative sentencing. At the same time, the Judiciary Committee has moved 2 bills out of committee. I want to see these bills have a vigorous discussion and debate on the floor of the House so that we can move to conference. Time is going, and let us not let the perfect be, in essence, the downfall of change. So H.R. 3713 provides for the reduction of sentencing for many who are languishing by law in prison today on the federal system. As I've spoken to people across the country, they have indicated that even though some states like my state, Texas, has made enormous strides, proud of that it has not happened around the country. The bully pulpit of the federal government can be the most effective tool to moving toward criminal justice reform and sentencing reduction, dealing with felony drug offenses. We are moving toward that point. A vote on the floor of the House and moving toward conference can move our efforts to legislation that can truly be responsive to both concerns and as well positives that are in that bill. So as we deal with this prison to pipeline, we've got to not only talk, we've got to do. And when we do, we've got to make sure that we respond to the concerns, but we've also got to make sure that we move legislation that can ultimately come out of the Senate and go to conference and make a difference in the lives of so many. I want to thank the gentlelady from Ohio. Excuse my raspy voice. I also want to say how timely the Congressional Black Caucus is. All that have been crying out, from Black Lives Matter to the mothers of the movement, is that we need changes dealing with the whole vastness of criminal justice reform. Police community relations, police actions, actions dealing with guns, actions dealing with the loss of life of our young people. Let's get a framework that can allow us to debate, to fix, to amend, and to get a product that will ultimately be signed by the President of the United States on behalf of the people of the United States who are crying out for relief. I yield back.
Gentlewoman.
Congressman Lee.
Gentlewoman,
Mr.
time,
Speaker, let me just end by saying the urgency is now. And in the words of Nelson Mandela, it always seems impossible until it's done. Tonight, the Congressional Black Caucus says, let's get it done. Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields back. Pursuant to Clause 12 of Rule 1, the House stands